By early 1943, the war on the Eastern Front had reached a decisive crossroads. The German army, reeling from its catastrophic defeat at Stalingrad, desperately sought a way to regain the initiative. Meanwhile, the Red Army, bloodied but growing stronger, held a giant bulge in its front lines around the city of Kursk. This protruding salient, stretching over 200 kilometers from north to south, seemed to invite a powerful German counterblow. For Adolf Hitler, the Kursk salient was more than a geographic feature. It was an opportunity, a chance to deliver a victory so spectacular that it would erase the humiliation of Stalingrad and restore confidence across the collapsing Eastern Front. Operation Citadel was conceived as a massive pincer strike. Elite German formations, including SS Panzer Corps and the Ninth Army, would attack simultaneously from north and south, closing around Kursk like the jaws of a trap. But unlike in 1941 or 1942, the Germans were no longer attacking an unprepared enemy. The Soviets were watching. Partisans, reconnaissance aircraft, and radio intercept units had pieced together the German plan long before the first Tiger tank rumbled forward. Stalin's high command, the Stavka, understood exactly what Citadel aimed to achieve, and resolved to turn the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified battlefield the world had ever seen. The Red Army began transforming the steppe into a maze of trenches, minefields, tank traps, and fortified strongpoints. Entire divisions dug defensive lines by hand. Engineers laid explosives across likely attack routes. Villagers and soldiers alike worked day and night, determined to ensure that when the German blow finally came, it would break, not through the walls of the salient, but upon them. By June 1943, both armies were massing their forces. The Germans assembled more than 2,700 tanks and assault guns, including the formidable Tiger and the new Panther. The Soviets prepared more than twice that number. The stage was set. Kursk would not be a battle of maneuver. It would be a test of endurance, an industrial, mechanical, and human collision on a scale the world had never seen. The Soviet preparations at Kursk were unlike anything previously attempted in modern warfare. When Stavka realized that the Germans intended to strike the salient, the Red Army began constructing a defensive system so vast and so intricate that German intelligence consistently underestimated its scale. What the Wehrmacht believed to be a single line of trenches was, in reality, a layered fortress stretching over 300 kilometers. The first defensive belt alone contained thousands of trenches arranged in zigzag patterns to absorb artillery fire. Behind them lay machine gun nests, mortar pits, dug-in anti-tank guns, and camouflage observation posts. But this was only the beginning. Engineers constructed a second belt, then a third, then a fourth, each one designed to grind down German armor and force the attackers to pay for every meter of ground in blood and steel. Yet the true power of the Soviet defense lay beneath the soil. Millions of mines, anti-tank and anti-personnel, were sown across the likely avenues of attack. In some sectors, Soviet engineers laid up to 2,400 mines per kilometer, an unprecedented density that turned the steppe into a deadly labyrinth. For German armored units, advancing meant not only facing dug-in defenders, but navigating through hidden explosive webs that could immobilize even the mighty Tiger. Tank traps and anti-tank ditches further reinforced the defensive network. Deep gouges carved into the earth forced German tanks to slow down, pivot, or bunch together, making them perfect targets. Soviet infantry units rehearsed anti-tank tactics repeatedly, preparing ambush spots where armor-piercing rifles, grenades, or Molotov cocktails could be used at close range. Every village, every rise in the ground, every copse of trees had been integrated into a deliberate killing zone. The Red Army also concealed large mobile reserves behind the defensive belts. These armored formations, including Guards Tank Corps, waited silently for the moment when the German spearheads would become bogged down. Then the Soviet counterblow would begin. This was not merely a defense. It was a machine designed to slow, bleed, and ultimately stop the most powerful armored force the world had ever seen. Kursk was becoming an iron wall, and Germany was marching straight into it. For the Germans, Operation Citadel was meant to be the blow that restored strategic momentum on the Eastern Front. At the heart of their plan was the belief in the superior armor. The Tiger Y, heavily armored, armed with the deadly 88mm KWK-36 gun, and almost invulnerable from the front, was the pride of Germany's panzer divisions. By the summer of 1943, many German commanders were convinced that the Tiger alone could cut through anything the Soviets placed before them. As the offensive began on July 5th, the Tigers of the elite Grossdeutschland Division and the Waffen-SS spearheaded the attack. Their thick armor shrugged off the fire of most Soviet anti-tank guns. Early in the advance, Soviet infantry positions were crushed, trenches flattened, and machine gun nests silenced by the 57-ton giants. German crews felt the familiar surge of confidence. This was what their tanks were built for, a decisive breakthrough on open ground. The Tiger's long-range firepower allowed it to engage Soviet tanks well before the enemy could respond effectively. T-34s destroyed at over a kilometer reinforced the myth of German mechanical superiority. Even Soviet KV heavy tanks struggled to survive direct hits. Radio communication, superior optics, and the cohesion of experienced crews gave the Tiger formations a sense of invulnerability as they pressed deeper into the Soviet lines. But this confidence masked emerging problems. The steppe was not open terrain. It was a layered minefield, an engineered trap designed specifically to neutralize German strengths. As Tigers advanced, they did not find open maneuver space. They found narrow corridors cleared of mines, easily targeted by Soviet artillery. Engineers struggled to keep up, clearing paths under fire. Each explosion that immobilized a tank, even a Tiger, jammed the flow of the entire attack, causing formations to bunch together. The Tiger was a weapon of shock and power, but it was not agile. Thick armor and powerful guns could not overcome the simple physics of movement through terrain deliberately shaped to slow it down. And every meter forward meant deeper penetration into zones packed with hidden explosives, dug-in anti-tank guns, and waiting ambush teams. The Tigers pressed on, firing, advancing, and crushing forward. But for the first time, they were entering a battlefield designed not to defeat them in a single blow, but to bleed them slowly, relentlessly. The predators of the Eastern Front were discovering that this time, the battlefield was hunting them. As the German armored spearheads pushed deeper into the Kursk salient, their advance soon collided with the first of the Soviet mine belts, vast, invisible barriers stretching across the landscape. To the Germans, mines had always been an inconvenience, a delay. But at Kursk, they formed the backbone of the Soviet strategy: slow the panzers, break their tempo, force them into predictable paths, and expose them to fire. The minefields were not random scatterings of explosives. They were crafted with mathematical precision. Each suspected avenue of advance was saturated with anti-tank mines, often laid in overlapping grids that ensured even the slightest deviation would trigger an explosion. Some sectors contained up to 3,000 mines per kilometer, buried just deep enough to remain unseen, yet close enough to maximize damage. As tigers and panthers rolled forward, the first detonations erupted beneath them. A tiger's heavy armor often kept the crew alive, but the blast could tear off tracks, break suspension components, or leave the tank immobilized in the killing zone. An immobile tiger was as good as dead, not because of its crew, but because it blocked the narrow paths through which the rest of the attack had to move. Engineers rushed forward, crawling under artillery fire to clear paths by hand. Mine-clearing teams used probe rods, detectors, and even explosives, but the mine density overwhelmed every attempt at rapid progress. Each cleared corridor was a funnel, perfectly aligned with Soviet artillery observers, waiting to rain shells on any tank trapped inside. Soviet defenders, concealed in trenches and bunkers, watched as German armor slowed to a crawl. Panzer formations compressed together, losing their ability to maneuver, their greatest tactical advantage slipping away inch by inch. Whenever a mine detonated, dust and smoke rose into the air, signaling to Soviet gunners exactly where to aim. For the first time in the battle, the Tiger's aura of invincibility cracked, not because the mines could destroy them outright, but because they robbed the Germans of their most precious resource, momentum. The roar of engines was replaced by the hollow thud of detonations and the relentless artillery fire that followed. The iron wall was no longer an abstract concept. It was a physical barrier of explosive force, one that even the strongest armor could not simply drive through. When the German spearheads became entangled in the mine belts, the Soviet defenders unleashed the next layer of their carefully engineered trap, a storm of artillery fire and anti-tank ambushes designed to break the momentum of even the strongest armored divisions. From concealed positions across the salient, Soviet artillery batteries opened fire with devastating precision. They had spent weeks registering their guns on every likely choke point, every clearing, every bend in the terrain where German armor might bunch up. Now those calculations paid off. Shells rained down in tightly grouped barrages, striking immobilized tanks, engineer teams, and clustered vehicles that had no room to maneuver. The German radio channels filled with urgent calls, requests for smoke, for counter-battery fire, for air support. But the sheer density of explosions drowned out coordination. Dust clouds rolled across the battlefield, masking Soviet movements and disorienting German crews trapped inside their steel coffins. Then came the anti-tank guns. The Red Army had deployed thousands of them, 45-millimeter guns in shallow pits, 76-millimeter guns concealed behind ridges, heavy 122-millimeter pieces waiting for long-range shots. Many were dug so deep into the earth that only the muzzle protruded, nearly impossible for German tank crews to spot. The tactic was simple and brutally effective. Wait until a tiger or panther halted in a minefield, then strike its flanks. Even a tiger's thick armor could be penetrated when hit from the side at the right angle. The Germans had entered a battlefield where every immobilized tank became a beacon for Soviet gunners. As the hours passed, Soviet anti-tank teams crept forward with rifles, grenades, and shape-charge mines. Some waited in foxholes only meters from the corridors the Germans tried to use. When a panzer slowed, they rose like ghosts, sprinting toward the steel giants before disappearing back into smoke and trenches. German commanders pushed their men forward, insisting that the breakthrough was still possible, but every advance tightened the Soviet noose. German armor was no longer driving the attack, it was surviving it. The battle was shifting. The Tigers were still deadly, still feared, but the Soviets had forced them into a fight where firepower alone could not save them. As the battle deepened, a chaotic and terrifying zone emerged between the Soviet defensive belts and the stalled German armor. This was the gray zone, a landscape of shattered earth, burning vehicles, craters, and trenches where infantry fought at ranges measured in meters. Here, the advantage of the Tigers' thick armor meant little. Visibility was poor, mobility restricted, and every patch of ground concealed Soviet soldiers ready to strike. Soviet infantry units, specially trained for anti-tank close combat, moved like shadows through this deadly terrain. They operated in small groups, 3 to 5 men, carrying anti-tank grenades, Molotov cocktails, satchel charges, and the feared cumulatively-shaped charge mines. Their approach was deliberate: wait for a tank to halt, then swarm it from blind angles. German tank crews sensed them before they saw them. The thud of grenades bouncing off armor, the clatter of rifle fire against steel, the sudden bloom of flames from a Molotov. Each signaled that the close-quarters fight had begun. The Tigers' powerful cannons were useless at this distance, their machine guns limited by narrow firing arcs. A single Soviet soldier crawling through tall grass could threaten a 57-ton machine, worth its weight in gold to the Wehrmacht. Coordinated attacks were common. One group would distract the turret with small arms fire, while another sprinted toward the tracks, planting explosives under the road wheels. Others climbed onto engine decks, jamming hatches or dropping grenades through ventilation grates. Soviet commanders understood that immobilizing a panzer was almost as valuable as destroying it. Once stuck, it blocked routes and became a target for artillery. German infantry struggled to keep pace with their tanks. Many panzer divisions were under strength in supporting infantry, leaving armored spearheads exposed. When Soviet riflemen infiltrated gaps, they cut off isolated tanks, forcing German crews into desperate defensive measures. Some crews fired their hull machine guns blindly into smoke and ruins. Others rotated turrets frantically, searching for attackers they could hear but not see. Amid the chaos, bravery was displayed on both sides. German grenadiers fought to protect stranded tanks, dragging wounded crewmen from burning hulls. Soviet soldiers crawled through fire to deliver their charges. The gray zone consumed men and machines alike, transforming the battlefield into a brutal hand-to-hand struggle where technology mattered less than nerve, speed, and sheer determination. By the end of these close-quarters battles, many German armored formations had been bled dry, not destroyed by long-range duels, but by invisible fighters striking from the ground beneath them. The Germans entered Kursk believing their armor was unmatched, but the Red Army had spent months preparing the weapons that would shatter this illusion. Across the salient, concealed in dugouts, camouflaged behind tree lines, and buried into the slopes of low hills, the Soviets had positioned thousands of anti-tank weapons, each waiting for the moment when a Tiger would slow, turn, or expose its flank. Foremost among these was the 76.2 millimeter ZS-3, a versatile field gun that had earned legendary status among Soviet crews. While it struggled against a Tiger's frontal armor, It could reliably penetrate side plates at medium range. Crews learned to wait, hold their fire, and strike only when success was assured. Many Tiger commanders recalled the sudden, explosive punch of a well-placed Soviet shell hitting from a direction the crew never saw. Then there were the dedicated tank killers, the 57mm ZS-2, a gun so powerful that early in the war German intelligence believed the Soviets were exaggerating its performance. At Kursk, its long barrel and high-velocity rounds proved deadly. A single hit to a Tiger's turret ring or lower hull could disable the tank instantly. ZIS-2 crews often hid in pits barely large enough to contain the gun, lowering the silhouette until it became almost impossible to detect. The Soviets also deployed heavier guns, the 85mm, 100mm, and even 122mm artillery pieces, all capable of destroying German armor with catastrophic force. Some were positioned to deliver plunging fire onto German tanks trapped in depressions or forcing their way up slopes. When a shell from these larger guns struck, the impact tore through both armor and crew compartments, leaving only burning hulks behind. But perhaps the most feared anti-tank weapon was not a gun at all. It was the Soviet anti-tank rifleman, lying motionless in tall grass. Although their PTRD and PTRS rifles could not penetrate Tiger armor directly, they targeted vulnerable points: optics, track pins, fuel lines, radiators. A disabled tank, stuck in place, became a perfect victim for follow-up strikes. Coordination was key. Soviet spotters relayed German movements to nearby batteries. When a Tiger became immobilized, gun crews shifted fire instantly, concentrating multiple guns on a single target. The battlefield became a deadly chessboard where every German move triggered a Soviet counter. The myth of the Tiger's invulnerability began to collapse not because of a single weapon, but because of a system, layered, coordinated, and executed with relentless discipline. By the end of the seventh day of fighting, German commanders realized a harsh truth. The Soviets had mastered the art of killing Tigers. By the eighth day of fighting, the Germans understood that Kursk was not a battlefield. It was a fortress the size of a small country. Every kilometer forward felt like an assault on another fortified line, each more complex and deadly than the last. What made the Kursk salient truly extraordinary was not a single killing field or a single trench system, but the depth of the Soviet defense. It stretched backward for over 300 kilometers, forming the densest defensive network of the entire Second World War. The first layer was designed to slow, the second, to bleed, the third, to stop, the fourth, to destroy. German maps quickly became useless. By the time a tank battalion broke through one belt, it faced another just beyond the smoke. Soviet engineers had crafted the defenses with mathematical precision, trench lines interlocked in geometric patterns, creating kill zones where infantry and armor could be caught from multiple angles. Anti-tank guns were positioned so that if an enemy avoided one field of fire, it entered another. Behind this lay the artillery belts, hundreds of batteries arranged in depth. When a German formation broke through the outer obstacles and gained momentum, Soviet commanders activated the next layer. A rolling barrage of shells crashed down on the advancing troops, forcing them to halt, disperse, and reposition. Momentum died in seconds. Then came the reserve trenches. These were manned by fresh rifle units who had waited for days underground, listening to distant explosions. Their role was not glamorous but essential: to absorb the shock of breakthrough, seal gaps, and hold the line long enough for Soviet counterattacks to form. Further behind lay the armored reserves, units like the 2nd and 5th Guards tank armies. They remained hidden from reconnaissance aircraft, dispersed in forests and ravines. When unleashed, they struck with overwhelming force against exhausted German formations, already drained by the endless defensive belts. Each layer of defense fed into the next, forming an ecosystem of resistance. Mines slowed tanks so that artillery could target them. Trenches forced infantry into predictable paths where machine guns could sweep across narrow corridors. Anti-tank guns waited behind camouflage nets, covering avenues created by the mines. Nothing existed in isolation. Every element served a larger operational design. For the Germans, this depth was devastating. They could break a line, but not the system. Each kilometer cost tanks, fuel, ammunition, and most critically, time. Kursk was not simply a battlefield. It was a machine built to grind an army down layer by layer. By the time German spearheads reached the Third Belt, they were exhausted, depleted, and facing the grim reality. The deeper they pushed, the stronger the Soviets seemed to become. By early July 12th, the German offensive had reached its moment of maximum effort. Their armored spearheads, Tiger battalions, Panther regiments, and assault gun units were finally pushing through the last layers of Soviet defenses south of Prokhorovka. But in the fields beyond, concealed in the wheaten hollows of the steppe, the Red Army had prepared its answer. The Soviets had been watching the German advance with mathematical precision. Every kilometer the Tigers gained had been predicted, plotted, and planned for. The deeper they drove into the salient, the narrower the corridor became, until the German spearheads found themselves compressed into a bottleneck of their own making. Here the Soviets would strike, hidden in ravines, forests, and behind low ridgelines. The armored might of the 5th Guards tank army waited. Hundreds of T-34s, Churchills, and heavy KV-1s sat in silence. Engines were warm. Ammunition was stacked within arm's reach. Commanders crouched over maps illuminated by dim lamps, receiving their final instructions. The Soviet plan was brutally simple: attack at full speed and at point-blank range. Soviet doctrine understood that Tiger tanks were nearly invulnerable at long range. But at 200 meters? At 100 meters? Even a 76mm shell could crack armor if it struck the right angle. The T-34s did not need elegance. They needed proximity. At 8:30 a.m., the fields around Prokhorovka erupted as thousands of horseshoes of steel began to rumble forward. Tank tracks dug into the earth, engines roared, and dust spiraled into the sky. The Soviet charge was not cautious. It was a storm, designed to shock, overwhelm, and crush the German armored spearhead before it could reorganize. As the T-34 surged across open ground, German gunners scrambled to adjust. Their optics were excellent, but the Soviets were too close, too fast, and too numerous. At such distances, the Tigers' long-barreled 88mm guns found it difficult to traverse quickly enough. Many Tigers were struck on the sides as Soviet tanks rammed into the melee. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. Tanks collided at full speed. Crews fired from half-buried positions. Infantry clung to the sides of moving vehicles, dismounting into trenches as the armored wave rolled past. Soviet anti-tank rifle units sprinted between burning wrecks, finishing off immobilized panzers with shaped charges. The counterstrike's purpose was not to annihilate the Germans outright. It was to break their momentum. Every German tank knocked out, every assault gun halted, meant the offensive was dying by the minute. The Soviets understood that the Germans were running out of time, fuel, and coordinated strength. By midday, the German spearhead had stalled. Dust hung over the battlefield like smoke from a burning world. Wrecked tanks, German and Soviet, littered the fields. And yet, one fact became clear. The Germans would advance no further. The counterstrike had stopped them cold. The iron wall of Kursk had held. By the evening of July 12th, the battlefield around Kursk had transformed into a graveyard of steel. Smoke drifted across the fields, mingling with the dust kicked up by thousands of tracks. Burned-out T-34s and shattered Tigers lay side by side, their silhouettes torn open by fire and explosions. The thunder of battle had ebbed, but the consequences of the day were unmistakable. The German offensive had lost its momentum, and with it, any hope of victory. Hitler had hoped Operation Citadel would restore the strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. Instead, it became the moment that initiative slipped from German hands forever. The offensive had been designed around the Tiger's supposed invincibility, around the belief that superior armor and firepower could punch a hole through the Soviet lines. But Kursk had proven that the Red Army's new way of war, layered defenses, coordinated firepower, and massed counterattacks, was more than a match for Germany's elite armor. In the aftermath, German commanders surveyed the cost. Entire battalions of Panthers lay immobilized by mines. Tiger companies, once symbols of unstoppable might, had been reduced to fragments. The Luftwaffe, worn down by endless sorties, could no longer guarantee air supremacy. Ammunition stores ran low. Fuel convoys never reached the front. The offensive had become unsustainable. Meanwhile, the Soviets were not exhausted. They were rising. Barely days after stopping the German spearheads, the Red Army launched its own offensives at Orel in the north and Belgorod-Kharkov in the south. What began as a defensive stand became a sweeping, rolling counter-offensive that forced the Germans into a continuous retreat. Kursk was no longer just a battle, it was a turning point. For the Tiger crews, the battle left a bitter lesson. Their tanks were powerful, but power alone could not overcome a defense built with intelligence, preparation, and numerical superiority. Many German veterans later recall Kursk as the moment they realized the war could no longer be won. The Soviet war machine had become too large, too skilled, too resilient. For Soviet soldiers, Kursk became a symbol of transformation. The Red Army that once staggered under the weight of blitzkrieg had now defeated Germany's best in a contest of firepower and strategy. The Iron Wall had held, and from this point forward, the Red Army would no longer react. It would drive the war toward Berlin. As dawn rose on July 13th, the battlefield lay silent except for the crackle of distant fires. But the meaning of Kursk echoed far beyond the steppe. It marked the end of the last great German offensive in the East, the death of the myth of the invincible Tiger, and the moment the momentum of the war shifted irrevocably. The Tiger had not been slain by a single blow, but by a system built to defeat it. And from that moment forward, the Red Army no longer fought for survival. It fought for victory.